Greetings and welcome to all our viewers who are streaming live at the comfort of their homes, wherever you are today. We'd love to welcome you to UNGUBANI movement. Today we are doing our 6th lecture, which is entitled, When Despair and Suffering Becomes Your Greatest Teacher. I believe that each and every one of us in this lifetime needs to hear this lecture. It is one of the most powerful lecture, and it is worth you taking your time to listen. It is worth you taking your time, even your resources, to listen to it. And before I introduce my speaker today, I would love to draw your attention to our Facebook or our social media platforms. We have an UNGUBANI YouTube channel where we wish that we get you to subscribe. And number 2, we have a Facebook page and Instagram. On Facebook, you will get us as UNGUBANI Movement. On Instagram, we are UNGUBANI_movement. So please engage with us on those pages. We want to hear your views. We want to hear you talking to us as a movement and giving us a feedback as per our lectures. And without any further waste of time, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to introduce our speaker today, Mnqobi Nyembe, the label that speaks. Mnqobi Nyembe is a founder of Atlas L Group, a wisdom counselor to all mankind, a businessman, a brand strategy curator, an author, an UNGUBANI 360 degrees coach. His mission is to inspire individuals to become balanced and impactful leaders who are good stewards of talent, time, money, self-actualization, and everyday life. Ladies and gentlemen, Mnqobi Nyembe. God bless you.
Let me take this opportunity and welcome you wherever you're joining us. And as Uzwide has said, we truly appreciate your support, that you are in the comfort of your home, but you are using your resources to join us live as we deliver this lecture. It's our 6th lecture. I hope you do get the time, or make the time, even as you are here on YouTube, once you are done with this lecture, to check other lectures that we've done. Lectures 1 to 5 are available for you to indulge. Our 6th lecture is titled, When Despair and Suffering Becomes Your Greatest Teacher. When despair and suffering becomes your greatest teacher. What I'm trying to do with this lecture is to help you realize that any despair and suffering that you go through can be used as an opportunity for you to learn about life, learn about yourself, but learn about people in general. In other words, then, as you go through your despair and your suffering, do not just despair and suffer alone, but use the opportunity to reflect, to introspect, to look back at your past despairs and sufferings and ask yourself, what has this taught me, or what does this tell me about me? Marcus Aurelius says in his book, Meditations, the art of living is more like wrestling than dancing, in that it stands ready for what comes and is not thrown by the unforeseen. When we say life is about wrestling, or it's a wrestle, it means you're not just going to go through life dancing and having fun, but sometimes you're going to be called upon to come out and fight. That despair you are facing right now, that suffering you're going through right now, who knows? It could be the very thing that shapes you and makes you realize you are greater than you think. In fact, when you look carefully at this issue of suffering and despair, I think nothing paints the picture better than the story that we once had in the TRC Commission. And I'm going to go through just now in terms of what Mason was saying through artistry that he gave. Humans have courage to face any despair or suffering visited upon them. This, for me, comes from the story, The Man Who Sang and the Woman Who Kept Silent, an artistry piece that was inspired by 2 stories Judith Mason heard on the radio at the time of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC hearings. They told of the execution of 2 liberation movements by the security police. Those cadres who were butchered or killed, one was Harold Sefula, who, as Mason relates, asked permission to sing Nkosi Sikelel' Africa before he was electrocuted. The other was Phila Ndwandwe, who was tortured and kept naked for 10 days and then assassinated in a kneeling position. As the TRC found, before Ndwandwe was killed, she fashioned a pair of panties for herself out of a scrap of blue plastic. This moved Mason to make a dress of blue plastic bags inscribed with text beginning, "Sister, a plastic bag may not be the whole armor of God, but you are wrestling with flesh and blood and against powers, against the rulers of darkness." Human life is a continuous struggle indeed. You can ask South Africans of their dark apartheid past. Not only was evil engineered by white on black, where natives became pariahs in their own land, some of their atrocities were a psychological gambit that included blacks who were prepared to turn against their own comrades. History has it that Phila was 24 when abductors, 4 men in the South African police uniform, saw their aim, through which was to turn her into an askari through torture. Phila refused to utter a single word. It was in October 1988 when she was taken by force from Manzini, Swaziland, to Pietermaritzburg, KwaZulu-Natal. They killed her and buried her body on a dairy farm, and she left behind baby Tabang, who was 2 months old at the time. It was revealed that the people who sold her out were comrades. Even when Phila was met with torture, she may have lost in terms of external power over those who plied her with evil, but she kept her inner power. She kept her courage. With an act as simple as not uttering a single word, she kept her power. Former security policeman, Warrant Officer Paul van Vuren, told of his great respect for one of the activists who had sung Nkosi Sikelel' Africa moments before being electrocuted with a 5 to 8 second burst of electricity from a portable generator. Think about it. Here you're about to be electrocuted, and your courage moves you to say to abductors and captors and those who are about to kill you, knowing they're going to kill you, you still are saying, "May I please sing Nkosi Sikelel' Africa one more time?" I had tremendous respect for Harold Sefula because of the way he behaved in the process of us killing him, Van Vuren said, reading a prepared statement to the Commission's Amnesty Committee chaired by Judge Hassan Moore. He was a strong person. He believed deeply in the correctness of that which he believed in. He said the ANC would govern later and that democracy would be the end of the Boers. What is despair? In dictionary, despair as a noun is the complete loss or absence of hope. So when somebody has no hope, they are in a state of despair. A verb, despair, is loss or being without hope. So as we lose hope and you be without hope, you reach a state called despair. Maybe right now you are going through your own despair. I do not know what is this thing that has rendered you without hope. Hopelessness comes from many things, I know. You could have hopelessness from love because somebody has dumped you and you are not hopeful that you could get somebody else. It could be hopelessness in divorce, that maybe the marriage that you thought you had is falling apart. It could be hopelessness because somebody has taken advantage of you, raped you, beaten you, or even lied about you. I do not know what despair you are facing, but we too can use that despair as our greatest teacher. What is suffering? Suffering is described as the state of undergoing pain, distress, or hardship. The state of undergoing pain, distress, or hardship. We then say you are going through suffering. When Billy Graham was doing one of his most last addresses before he passed, in fact, few years before he passed, because he was no longer speaking or taking engagements when he died, he did one of the amazing TED Talks, which was titled Technology, Faith, and Human Shortcomings. Billy Graham discusses 3 things that he says have been with mankind for centuries, and even technology has not assisted us to solve. Though now we can actually take advantage of technology and connect even with you in this lecture, though we are living during the times where our solutions are more medically, politically, otherwise, but these are three things that Billy Graham said even men have not been able to save himself from. The first problem that he found was death. The second problem that he found was evil. And the third one was suffering, which we are discussing today. Death. Why do we die? Where do we go when we die? Why do we even kill one another? Death is such a problem for mankind that no matter how many times you faced it, when it hits you, it feels fresh and it can bring despair and suffering anew. Evil, on the other hand, is a sad story because humans are capable of engineering evil on other humans. Slit somebody's throat while they're crying and asking for forgiveness, and you continue slitting their throat and kill them. The most of evils is, of course, the wars that are taking a place all over the world. People are fighting, other states are fighting each other. You find that America right now is ready to go to war with China. Where does that come from? Even in our families, there is evil that's happening where people are sort of wishing ill or bad for other people. I may not answer the issue of death or evil, but I'm ready to speak to you about the issue of suffering. It is not that I know why we suffer. I myself don't know. I'm going to be turning 39 next month, and I still can tell you, I do not know why we go through despair and why we go through suffering, but I know we're going to go through it nonetheless. And no matter how many times you've gone through despair and suffering, I can assure you there is another moment, opportunity you're going to get to go through despair and suffering. This is not me wishing you ill or despair and suffering, but I'm just guaranteeing you that you might as well accept that if despair and suffering will remain with you forever, then what you and I can do is to learn how to manage it and how to benefit from it as an advantage more than a disadvantage. There is a key UNGUBANI despair and suffering question that I wish we must all ask ourselves. What has despair and suffering taught you about yourself? What has despair and suffering taught you about yourself? There are a couple of lessons that I'm going to run through, 5 to be precise. UNGUBANI despair and suffering lesson number 1. You and I must learn to turn our despair and suffering into a self-masterclass. I believe you can use despair and suffering as your greatest teacher. I have, and this is how. The painter orders appearance on canvas. The sculptor imposes form on matter. And the jurist seeks regularities in human affairs. Me, I find courage in times of despair and suffering. This, for some reason, I've always managed to do. It doesn't matter what despair or suffering I face, whether in a person or circumstance, I've always come out of it victorious. It doesn't mean I've always gained materially, but even losses have brought me more in terms of return on wisdom. I know more today than I did 20 years ago, partly because I'm always learning, but mostly because of all the loss, despair, and suffering I've had to face overall. I've come to know myself more during times of despair and suffering. I know, for instance, that I make decisions very quickly, especially when pain is imminent. But that doesn't mean my character is rushed or hasty. I also know that I use logic a lot, and with this, I don't mind trading emotions for reason. It is always unfortunate, of course, when others are involved, as they can easily become victims without me intending such. But that doesn't mean that I don't care or I'm emotionless. The opposite is actually true. I always prioritize me, self. I can never turn my back on myself. I'm not selfish. I've just come to terms with the realization that I cannot feed others from the cup, but from the saucer. Therefore, my cup should overflow so that I feed others from more than and not from less than. I think I read it somewhere that givers must set the limits because takers want and will keep taking. So one of the things then that you must realize about suffering and despair is that it must make you choose you and choose self. Choose to give, but even manage how you are giving so that even those who are taking without giving anything in return do not deplete you to a point of hopelessness. People tend to regard me as impatient during times of despair. I guess it has to do with my pain repulsion and the fact that my basic virtues are being tested. I just don't understand why I should stay and tolerate something I know I can never accept or change. My quick exit serves to me to honor self so that I never lie to self or seek to be accepted by others at the expense of self. For a long time, I made all my despair and suffering very private and personal. I saw no point in letting the world know about all the darkness I was trying to battle. This meant that I disappeared from the face of the earth. I even had a special phrase for it, time for my wilderness. I've tried to outgrow this one, though I still find it hard to open up and expose my vulnerability. I've since learned that my redemption is in the heart of another man, my fellow brothers and sisters. After all, umuntu, ngumuntu, ngabantu. I've also learned through my suffering and despair that I'm highly susceptible to love in despair and suffering. In most cases, I've dated those I was meant to receive help from or give help to. I'm working very hard to outgrow this flaw as it undermines my reputation as a conqueror and a wise man. Maybe let me say that I've done very well in the past few years by offering my help without asking someone out, which has minimized my cost to self, and I can safely say that my personal balance sheet in people is looking way positive. I've been very bad in exposing my children to my despair and suffering, I must say, especially my eldest daughter. I believe there's a way to go through hell without your children knowing or even sensing it. By the way, all I'm doing here is to give you my own picture of my own despair and suffering and how I've dealt with it and what it has taught me. I had a tendency in the past to think that maybe my despair would have been far better off if I had a formal qualification, joining those who are cushioned by elusive facilities like credit cards, high credit scores, and overdrafts. But then, I've often dismissed this idea when I regularly come across educated fellows who remain trapped in and afflicted by the system. At one point, I even came to understand my patterns of despair and my patterns of suffering and tried to manage them. I remember how I had mastered to go on for 2 years without hitting rock bottom. But this can be very difficult when you also have high risk appetite for hitting major strides as a dreamer. My very bravery often becomes my source of great despair and my source of suffering. This I've come to learn and change. It doesn't mean I was naive though. Whenever I've gone through these sufferings and despairs, having chosen to go through myself, I knew exactly what I was putting myself through each time I chose risk over safety. My creativity gets big strokes during times of despair and times of suffering. I find more ways of approaching a stumbling block and addressing limitations. Sometimes I'll just crave disruption in order to discover the unknown and what lies underneath the surface. I'm more spiritually discerning during times of despair and during times of suffering. Maybe this is because I'm usually over alert during this time. I think it was Les Brown who said, "It's amazing how spiritual you get when you're in trouble." I think it has been true for me too. I no longer play church games though. In fact, I don't play church at all lately and hopefully never again. All in order to allow my personal relationship with God to flourish without the buzz effect of fellowship or getting along with this church or that church. I believe and appreciate that there is a true value in a true church, though few exist nowadays. What does suffering tell you about you? What does despair tell you about you? In fact, be careful when you go through despair and suffering that you don't go willy-nilly. You don't go blindly so, because you could miss on a chance. What am I saying to you? If somebody dumps you right now, if you know you can't get them back, at least use the experience to understand why the relationship ended, at what point, and what was your role. Because it takes two to tango. What does this tell you about those who exit you? What are some of the things you did wrong during the relationship when life was high? That is you. Instead of focusing on crying, which you must, and go through somebody or get over somebody, but you must also ask yourself, how did I lose this relationship? Not for the sake of fighting to get the person back at all cost, but for the sake of preparing yourself for future relationships. When I'm saying to you, what has suffering, despair told you about you or taught you about you, I mean, even when you lose a relative through death, you may cry that they've died, but I want you to go back and ask yourself, what does this tell me, or what has this taught me about death? What about the relationship that you may have had or lost or never had? What about the fact that they may have died with you with unforgiveness, or maybe you're holding a grudge on them, so that it teaches you that life is short. You could be alive today and be gone tonight. So I want you to realize that despair and suffering has a lot to teach us. For instance, when I go through despair and suffering, I experience more meanness and me time during times of despair and during times of suffering. I get to have a lot of conversations with myself, introspect, about a lot more other things. I get to reflect and do a lot more introspection. I look at more things and more things in detail. These I have in conversations with my own self because I'm an introvert and I'm intuitive in terms of my personality type indicator. When I go through despair and suffering, I get rest from times of despair and suffering. In fact, I guess because generally I sleep and hibernate a lot during this time of renewal. I mean, think about it. When you are going through despair and suffering, you may not have the means to go around, and you may find that friends have deserted you, have left you, as the going says, when times are tough, friends are few. Use that time, instead of chasing people or hating people that have left you, use that time for meanness and for introspection. Because as you go through suffering, at least one thing you must get: rest. No one is bothering you, then rest. No one thinks you are it, then rest. Oh my goodness, look at people who are famous these days. When they stop being famous, we forget who they are and where they are. But I like that period for them more, because once they're outside our eyes, then they're in their own eyes and in their own corners. When you listen to Zola 7, Nkosi Dlamini right now, in his interviews, he speaks positively of the moments of suffering and despair that he faces. Where is Umthembu, the famous man that made that lady famous on splashing money as the man that was the it at that day? The nice thing about it is that though he has suffered, but I'm happy for him because he's no longer in the eyes of public, or he's not losing anything further. He's by himself, probably somewhere, trying to build back life, trying to fight back life. But actually, I sometimes prefer that we suffer, because suffering brings us back to our senses. For instance, when I go through despair and suffering, I write a lot during times of despair. Being in a reflective mode gives my mind tons of interesting viewpoints and things to say about life, myself and humans in general. Though I'm maturing as I now study other people's despairs and suffering in order to avoid unnecessary learning from other people, my mistakes, or just disruptions for the sake of disruption, I'm still saying to you, when I go through my own suffering, I take time and reflect. This movement, UNGUBANI, came at a time when I was suffering. I had gone from knowing myself for years and standing as a public speaker and inspiring people and sending invoices and being booked to a point where I had to shut it all and not do it. Why was I shutting it all and not do it? I tell you, Mtana Sekaya, it is not fair to go through suffering and despair in public. So I ask you to withdraw yourself. Hoshimfe. Because once you are suffering in public, then it's exacerbated. You're going to have to lie. You're going to have to fake it. I say to you, pull out from the faces of the people and then be with yourself. And you'll find that even great ideas will be born out of your own suffering. I get to review all my relationships during times of despair. I get to review my circles of human connection accordingly. I widen it as I add new acquaintances and I narrow it as I remove those with whom my paths have served their purpose. I also get to touch base with relatives far and near during this time. I'm not social at all. In fact, that I'm antisocial is more accurate, and I've come to embrace this fact about me. People just drain me. I love people, but I also love my space. But when I go through suffering, I remember people. When I go through despair, I remember people even though I'm antisocial. I get to be selfless a lot during times of despair as well. I guess your needs unmet increase your own sensitivity to meet the needs of others, particularly during your lowest points. I'm generally a giver though, with a fat heart, but I'm more of a giver when I go through suffering and despair. I mean, when you go through suffering and despair, you'll be sharing a lot. When you go through suffering and despair, you'll be open to sharing a lot. So suffering, because you know what it's like to miss or not to have something or to lack, you'll be easy then in sharing. With despair and suffering comes more wisdom, and wisdom breeds a bit more patience about me. I think it was St. Paul who said, we also rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. I've found the same to be true in my own life during times of despair and suffering. I've always had this inclination, as taught by Ugogo, that whatever I did not have was hidden in the people around me and many who I'm yet to meet. That my despair and suffering can be addressed by the courage of another fellow human being. The same is also true about my own courage that is meant to serve as redemption for others in despair. Now, what is nice, even as I speak to you right now, these lectures that I'm giving to you, though there is research work and the body of work that we've put in as a team to work on our research so that we are concise and thorough, but most of these things I'm teaching are my own scars. It's the things that I had to suffer to learn or acknowledge. Can you imagine then how my life would have been if I didn't have these despairs and sufferings of the past? Probably my own conviction would have not been as it is. Maybe I would have been too selfish as a man, because I would have not needed anyone. But actually, the fact that I've suffered and I've gone through despair means I know that I need people. But also I know that I'm a solution to people. You would often see people who've not suffered. You'd often see people who've not gone through despair. When they meet that who's suffering at the moment, they're very insensitive. Why? Because they themselves don't know what it's like. The level of my suffering and how long my despair lasts is always relative to my social and relationship capitals. My courage, therefore, is not a selfish act. I may be responsible for its center, but its broadness is subject to the quality and the location of the people I'm invested in at any given time. When I come across moments of frustrations as a result of my despair and suffering, I find myself with a phone in my hand, scrolling down my contact list to see who can I ring up for personal aid. The idea is to always screen and categorize all the people I know according to their bearing towards the core of my soul, to be self-identified and to be other-identified. This may sound self-seeking, but it's not. I'm always aligning people I know to the times so that when I'm running low on something, I can always try and outsource what I'm missing elsewhere. People are a solution to me, and I'm a solution to people, at least I try. This I am because of suffering and despair that I've gone through. It was Dr. Howard Thurman who advocated that the deep hunger of my own heart, trying to find solace in the hearts of others, as their own hunger is trying to do the same, is how we should live our lives. He says we must use our own hearts as a way to reach other people's hearts. In other words, he says our heart must be a revolving door so that there is constant flow as you give yourself to others and as those others give themselves to you. So in other words, you must be a good giver, but also a good receiver. The hinges that keep this door revolving securely must be love, the divine order. My reaction during times of despair is simple. I go deep within me, find the roots to my own hunger of the heart, and whatever I find, I then universalize. So I've gone deep within myself during moments of despair and suffering. And one of the things that I know that I've found within myself is that I'm a man who's not so immune to suffering. That I've found within me. What does that mean then? It means because I've found it in me that I'm not immune to suffering, therefore I'm patient and I'm tolerant to others because they too are not immune to suffering. I've gone through my own suffering and despair, and I've found that sometimes you try all solutions and all things and you still fail. And therefore, I'm kind to those who failed and have tried instead of looking down on them or judging them or misjudging them. I've gone within my own suffering and my own despair, and I've found that sometimes it's got nothing to do with you. Sometimes you are not suffering and in despair because there's something you did, but it's just life happening. That sometimes the seasons of life or the zeitgeist of life, which is the spirit of the times, will happen to you too, because it happens to me too. What does that mean then? It means my own suffering and despair has assisted me to be more sensitive to human needs and to people. I still ask you, what has your own suffering taught you about yourself? Marcus Aurelius says in his book Meditation, further, when you talk about mankind, view earthly things as if looking down on them from some point high above. Flocks, armies, farms, weddings, divorces, births, deaths, the hubbub of the law courts, desert places, various foreign nations, festivals, funerals, markets, all the medley of the world and the ordered conjunction of opposites. This, for me, is encouraging because it says, when you look from an elevated position and look down on life, you'll then realize you may have flocks, but you may lose those flocks. You'd realize you may have armies being in defense, but sometimes you can be defenseless when you lose those armies. You may have farms and land, but also you may have nothing. You may have a wedding, but also you may have a divorce. You may have a birth, but also you may have a death. You may go through desert places in your life where things are dry, but also you may go through times where things are great. He says then, go through them all. If you go through a funeral, be in the mode of a funeral and enjoy and experience it. When I say enjoy, I mean go through it without regrets. But know that while there's a window for funeral, don't cry forever and stay there. There could be another opportunity for you to go through a festival. But when you go through a festival, do the same. Enjoy it. Dress up. Do what you need to do. But you may go to markets as well and meet different people. So what it means then, here, Marcus Aurelius is saying to us, as you go through life, realize nothing is permanent, but also realize it is your experience that makes things so. UNGUBANI, despair and suffering, lesson number 2 is use the power of affirmations. I've always managed to find courage in times of despair and suffering. I think it's in my name as a conqueror, Mnqobi. This is not a shade of pride in the parade of grandeur. This to me is self-assurance, which is one of my top talents. I believe in myself so much, like broad shoulders, spine erect, head straight type of confidence. This has been my beacon of hope in times of despair and suffering. I've made a conscious decision to face all despair and suffering with courage, to use my last despair and suffering as a point of reference in order to face my next one with even more courage. Yes, each despair has been unique in its own shape and form. Some have been so large I thought they would kill me, but instead they made me stronger. And others have appeared so small and yet their ripple effect nearly toppled me over. I'm not suggesting that you underplay your despair. No, that's denial. I'm suggesting that you embrace it in the paradigm of a teacher, always with a life lesson for you. Whenever despair shows up, the ideal response for me has always been to look within. Therefore, when I go through suffering and despair, I begin by saying, I'm bigger than this. I'm greater than this. I was made for such a time as this. I possess innate power to withstand any predicament, threat, or limitation. I've seen worse things than this. I've survived worse things than this. I may not know how I'm going to overcome this one, but I know I will because I've overcome others in the past of the same nature or worse. I'm a child of favor. I'll make it. I have what it takes. Say what you need to say to yourself in front of a mirror. Because sometimes the world will leave you and you'll be by yourself. But if you know that power of affirmations is what you have at your disposal, then you'd use affirmation wisely. So I say to you then, sometimes you may need to keep a journal and write your affirmations down. Some of the affirmations you may need to have are the spiritual affirmations, where if you're a Christian, you'll pick up scriptures and sort of put them there. Understand when the Bible says we are conquerors, write what this means and find where that in the scripture does it say. When it says health and prosperity is ours, go then and see where that is. When it says you must live and live by love and love alone, go then and put those. Because when you go through suffering and you go through despair, sometimes you forget even something as simple as, this too shall pass. But if you've written it somewhere and you remind yourself and you say to yourself, your mind, your heart, your body, your heart, and your everything begins to connect and remember. Because despair and suffering, remember, what it does is it brings you to a point of hopelessness. And therefore you become inferior. And therefore you become less than. And therefore you become somebody with self-esteem because you are going through suffering. Sometimes you go through poverty and you think the whole world can see that you didn't eat anything today. But you must remind yourself then, so that when all the noise and chaos is ringing, you then have to speak the voice of comfort and tell yourself these things. I love it because thina maZulu asifani nezinye izizwe. Sihlukile. Thina maZulu sinento ebizwa ngeyibongo. Insizwa umikhulu ibibongo umisencane. Yini kahle hle ibongo? Ibongo abantu abahlala nawe okuyibona eniphila nabo enibuthwe nabo eniyibutho nabo bayakubuka ngesikhathi wenza izinto bathi awunangu eqabule shesha sebeyabhala umqabula sheshe lo awunangu madoda umayethu uyangena akavinjwa lo bese bethi uqamuka avinjelwa mhla usuvunula usuthi uyagida esigcawini sebekubonga ngeyibongo benzani. They are giving those words back to you. They are reminding you of what you've done. Take ibongo of the fallen king. Inkosi uGoodwill Zwelithini kaBhekuzulu. Go to izibongo zakhe. Read those carefully. You'd find that embedded in that language is the prose and art of telling us of the things that he went through. Take ibongo kaShaka, ilembele manje ngokukhalipha and go deeper into those bongo zakhe. Ziyakutshena ukuthi indoda lebithi uma ifika yona ibingadla umhlambo wenkomo, ibidla umhlambo wenyamazana. Because uma efika ubethatha umuzi athathe nehlathi athathe nesigodo uShaka. Konke lokho sekufaka kuzibongo. Ngiyasithanda isiZulu ngoba siyangikhumbuza then ukuthi noma sekunzima, sengisempini lapha ngishaya, silwa laphana, mabe ngibonga bayangikhumbuza ukuthi awunanga umqabule shesha madoda, awunanga uqamuka avinjelwa. Those things in your mind, they ring true and revive your energy and your spirit. Ungubani despair and life lesson and suffering lesson number 3. Don't be a victim, choose. Every self must choose his own destiny, no matter what his father did, no matter what life throws at you. Choose self over compromise. I tell you, it is easy to compromise. In fact, you need to just forget. Just forget who you are and forget what you stand for, then you are compromised. Forget your truth and forget what you are going towards, then you are compromised. Forget whose child you are, then you are compromised. Forget of your own power and abilities, then you are compromised. I'm saying choose self over compromise. It is always said when I meet somebody who blames other people for what has befallen them, and you ask them, but why do you blame others? He says, I trusted him, or I gave them all my life. Don't give people all your life. No one is worth all your life. Because at the end of the day, you have self. At least you can give other things, but never give self to compromise. Choose family over resentment. I hear people tell us about all these funny words like black tax and all of those nonsense. I call them nonsense because if I was raised by a community, and if my mother's sister is the one who looked after us, and my own mother and my uncles, and I benefited from them, how dare when I have resources, I start selecting who I'm going to give because there is now black tax. It's family. It's family. But yes, you cannot be resentful about it, where you start giving from not having much. Because if you give from not having much, then of course you'll be resentful. But go to school, study, get a good job, start a good business, make your money. But remember, family is family, and therefore choose family. Because when all is said and done, the friends, the people you know, they may be gone, but family would remain because they are part of your ancestry. Choose peace over chaos. Oh, this world is full of chaos. There will be chaos about you where people just misunderstand you. You say one thing, they blow it out of proportion. There will be chaos about your mistakes as if people themselves don't make mistakes. Where you make an honest mistake that can be made anyone, but there are people who will blow it out of proportion and try and capitalize. I'm telling you, do not be taken by chaos. Go back to peace. The fourth lesson that you can learn from despair and suffering as your greatest teacher, ngithi mina fana noJobe. When you read scriptures, if you're a Christian, you'll hear a story of a man called Job of Uz. That one day as he was sitting, he had messengers come. Every 10 minutes, there was a messenger telling him something wrong had happened with his family or with his possessions or something that he owned. In 1 minute, one servant came and said 3,000 camels, 500 yokes of oxen, 500 donkeys were all wiped out in a flash. This was made worse when the other messenger came and said to him, your sons and daughters were having a party at the eldest son's place, and they are no more, they are dead. And, it went on and on in terms of what he had lost in that period. But think about it though. Uma ngithi ufana noJobe, what I mean is, realize that suffering has got dimensions. Job suffered physically, he suffered emotionally, he suffered spiritually, and he suffered intellectually. Those for me are important. Fana noJobe then means, even if you may lose a child right now and your child dies, Fana noJobe then means you'll go back and say, this was a physical suffering because I lost my child and I've had to bury them. And go back then and realize, though I lost my child, I still have hope and I still have me and I still am a child to somebody. So what Job was doing, he was going around to his wife, to his friends, and he was saying to them, please help me with my suffering. And they were saying all the things they were saying. A wife saying, I man, curse God and die. His friends were saying, this is unfair. Until one day Job realized to say, no, man, it's not that I'm suffering because my friends are telling me these things. He remembered one thing. He says, to this earth I came with nothing, and I'll take nothing with me. My goodness. For me, it means, even if I can achieve material, I must remember I could lose it the next minute. Even though I could have a child, and they grow up and be healthy, I could lose them to something. I could lose them to drugs. I could lose them to drugs. I could lose them to crime. I could lose them to death itself. Because if you remember then that you came with nothing, then you would not attach more to things. It doesn't mean don't be grateful to what you're having, but do not attach yourself more to things, because things of this world dissipate. Today you have them, today they're gone. Tomorrow they are given, the next day they are taken away. I want you then, ufane noJobe, do not get attached to material and things. The last one, UNGUBANI, despair and suffering, lesson number 5, change your thinking. For me, this is important then, because it says to me, sometimes thinking in a particular way is the very reason why you are suffering and your suffering is worse. Because then, if you don't have something to eat, it's one thing. That's a point of suffering. But the minute you start thinking, oh no, my life is pointless, I don't have anyone, everyone hates me, then you're adding on not having anything to eat. It's now your own thinking. If you are suffering because somebody has dumped you, that is what has happened to you and you didn't choose. But the minute you say now, no, I'm not going to get any person after this one, my life is pointless and it's going to come to an end, that is now your thinking that exacerbates suffering. So be careful of what you think and say during times of despair and suffering. I mean, think about it. This, if you didn't know, Virgin Atlantic airline, which is owned by Richard Branson, was started in a very interesting way. There was a cancelled flight, and many of us, when you have a cancelled flight, you can get frustrated and be angry. But for a billionaire, Richard Branson, it was different. Though he got frustrated and angry, he was an entrepreneur, and he had been in business for some time. I mean, he had ran things like Virgin Records, and he has made money. So when his flight was cancelled, he thought about it, and he says, what can I do? This flight that he was going to take was, as a British entrepreneur, he was going to go and visit a lady that he had not seen for 3 weeks. He was going to move from his island and go to an island where this lady was staying. And the British Virgin Islands, where she was staying, he was visiting this lady to British Virgin Island, and he realizes that the flight is cancelled. And he says to the people, you know what, airplane, and he calls them Boeing. He calls Boeing and he says, airline, I need your assistance, please. I need to hire a plane. They're like, hire the whole plane? He says, yes, I need to hire a plane. They say, come. And they take his credit card. He then pays what it's going to cost to hire a plane. Luckily, he could afford it. He had hired a plane that's going to take him there to British Virgin Islands. But he realizes that, you know what, I already have Virgin Records, and I'm going to British Virgin Islands where my girlfriend is staying. Maybe I must write on a board that there's a flight to Virgin, Virgin Airline. And he says, Virgin Airline, it's going to Virgin Islands at $39, please come. I mean, think about it. This meant he had to shift his thinking from being angry about a flight that is cancelled and going home and saying, I'm not going to visit this person. He wanted to see this lady so much. He ended up coming up with an idea. And the idea was from a cancelled flight, he ended up booking the entire flight and taking the entire crew and people to the island. Those probably were already despaired, or those who were already suffering and thinking anxieties and all of that. And he moved now from a man who was going to visit a friend to a man who had made so much money from the tickets that he had sold. Luckily for him, there were more people that needed to go to the British Virgin Islands, and therefore he made money from that trip. When they got on the other side, somebody said to him, maybe you must sort of improve a bit on your service because you've just become an airline owner. And yes, he became an airline owner. So what am I saying to you? Do like Richard Branson. When you are frustrated about things and things don't work out, change them. But actually, also mistakes can give rise or birth to great solutions, I tell you. These are some of the famous inventions. Do you know that penicillin, for instance, was discovered as a mistake? Microwave oven was discovered as a mistake. Post-it notes, those that you put on your books when you're reading, that have got colors, they were discovered as mistakes. They started as mistakes. Penicillin was discovered by Sir Alexander Fleming, a scientist. Ironically, Fleming was researching and searching for a wonder drug that could cure diseases. However, it wasn't until Fleming threw away his experiments that he found what he was looking for. When he threw away the experiments, he noticed that a contaminated petri dish he had discarded contained a mold that was dissolving all the bacteria around it. When he grew the mold by itself, he learned that it contained a powerful antibiotic called penicillin. Microwave oven. They were invented by Percy Spencer. Percy Spencer actually was looking at engineering a radar-related research project, which was a vacuum tube that he was building. And as he was doing that and conducting these radar-related researches, he realized that the candy bar in his pocket began to melt during his experiments. He has this tube that is heated, and he has chocolate in his pocket, and he realizes this thing is heated, but it's not even closer to this tube. It is somewhere in his pocket. He then put popcorn into the machine, and when it started to pop, he knew he had a revolutionary device in his hands. From a mistake, microwave was discovered. Post-it notes, they were discovered by Spencer Silver. As he was trying to work on a strong adhesive. He was working on a strong glue that he could use. While working away, silver created an adhesive that was actually weaker than what was already there. And when you put it, it didn't stick. But when you removed it, it didn't leave a mark. And he then realizes, man, something could work here. It was later then when a friend of his took those post-it notes and put it in the hymn book. Because as they were going to church to sing, they will put the post-it note. And he's like, come on, this can be used, by the way, to be dividers and to be markers when you're reading. Things that were mistakes, in the end, became great solutions. So the next time you're opening a microwave when you're done with this lecture and you're warming your lunch or you're warming your dinner, I want you to realize you are opening a mistake that was changed because somebody changed their thinking. Next time you go for penicillin with your doctor and you ask for your medical aid to give you a shot of penicillin, I want you to remember that you're injecting an antibiotic that was a mistake because somebody made a mistake, but actually it worked in the end. So what am I saying to you? I'm saying use your own mistakes. Use your own mistakes. Use your own mistakes to change your life around. Use your despair to change your life around. Use your suffering to change your life around. In the words of David Viscott, I hope you are going to go back now to your despair and suffering and say to you, if I cannot risk, I cannot grow. If I cannot grow, I cannot become my best. If I cannot become my best, I cannot be happy. And if I cannot be happy, what else is there? Risk to grow. Grow to become your best. Be your best to be happy. Because in the end, if suffering and despair shrinks you to a point of despair and suffering, it means it's shrinking you to a point of unhappiness. All despair that has come my way has come because of my own hunger to identify, inspire, succeed, and submit self to the larger life, which so often has been born out of great risk and the possibility that I might fail. Every growth has brought with it excellence, and every excellence, happiness, in fact, joy. So my life matters today because of all the despair and suffering, big and small, that I had to endure up to now. And this attitude has kept me, and it's the attitude I keep upholding in my life when I go through things so that I'm not delayed by situations and circumstances or realities that I go through in despair and suffering. Wena ungubani? Who are you during moments of despair and suffering? Ingabe ungakwagwala, uhlala ubaleka, o unyamakayishi, noma sezikuphekile inkinga kuyayifanela nje uyaqhubeka. Marcus Aurelius says, when circumstances force you to some sort of distress, quickly return to yourself. Do not stay out of rhythm for longer than you must. You will master the harmony the more by constantly going back to it. In other words, as you jump into a treadmill of life, it is the art of synchronizing yourself in running with that treadmill that ends up then giving you the fitness. Fitness doesn't come in jumping into a treadmill once. It is that adjustment that you go through and getting the rhythm so that as this belt is rolling under you, your feet are moving on top of it in synchronization. Despair and suffering must work the same way. As suffering happens to you, take it as a belt under your feet, as a treadmill, that if you can synchronize your rhythm properly, you'd find your dance and you would wrestle with life better. Humans cry when they are hurt, but despair is actually not hurtful. You'd come to realize that there is no pain in despair, but only painful memories of what and how things used to be, or the extent of loss as it is felt by a memorial heart. You can go through despair with a smile and hope, but you can also experience courage with tears and pain. Often great joy is experienced in solitude with nothing further than silence. Therefore, I propose a new paradigm for all of us. Let us from now on perceive both despair and courage as two dimensions of the same magnetic field of self, the positive side and the negative side of the magnet. To embrace loss as gain and gain as loss. To see beyond what appears directly, but also what lies indirectly. to embrace evil as an indirect relative of good, to embrace death as a repository of life, to embrace down as a springboard where up can safely launch, and depth as the root of height, to embrace scarcity as the base of abundance, to embrace success, to embrace hate as the opportunity to love, to embrace failure as a lesson for success, to embrace fear as the beginning of bravery, to embrace the end as a new beginning. Because either way, with courage or despair, we are still fearfully and wonderfully made. And nothing in us or about us is a mistake or deserves to be punished or read. And to free our conscience from human guilt. I did not say let us accept despair and suffering, but embrace it when it pays us a visit. And choose to lose from our gains and gain from our losses. And perceive nothing in life as either gained or lost. And in the face of despair, whether we sing as did Harold Sifula before he was killed, or keep silent as did Philandwandwe, I hope we come to learn about the courage of self to stand unafraid and unmoved, even at the threat of pain to body or torture of the human spirit. UNGUBANI, join the movement. Suffer if you will, despair if you must, but don't stay there for longer. The question is, when I've suffered, what do I do? Or as I suffer, what do I do? I want to take this last 3 minutes as I close now and address you, Mtana Sekhaya, as you are watching us live. This could just be a lecture to you, but also I know that maybe to you this is more real than I think. For me, I'm speaking about things that have happened in the past, and somehow speaking about them seems easy and simple, but maybe it doesn't seem like that because you are going through suffering right now. I want you to know, do not despair. I want you to know, go back then and realize this is an opportunity for you to learn more about self. Who knows? This death you've just experienced could be the very thing that reminds you to go back to some relatives that you haven't spoken to in years and rekindle relationships so that death doesn't bring regret. Who knows? Maybe this separation you're going through, which is threatening to be divorce, is something that reminds you that maybe you went away from what was core and important. Because if this marriage didn't mean much, now that it's threatening to end, it shouldn't mean anything to you after all. But the fact that it's painful, the fact that it's making you feel stuck, the fact that it's making you feel frustrated, maybe this is an opportunity for you to realize that suffering is here for a reason. There are children out there who don't know what they're going to do next. Doors of opportunities are closed on them. And they are looking at life and saying, why me, why me, why me? I want you to realize all you must do is keep hope. You may not have solutions. You may not know what to do, but just keep hope. Because if you keep hope, then there's hope for you. As you suffer and you despair, learn about yourself and take it as a masterclass. I thank you.